Welcome back once again, dear viewer. I'm sorry for the delay, but I've been sick lately. In fact, I may still sound a little croaky. But if I want to get this done before Halloween, and I do, we should get started. For those of you that missed part 1, well, I recommend that you watch it since I think it's pretty good. But this is my top 20 list of pieces of media that terrified me as a child, especially movies, TV shows, and media designed for young audiences. Although, since this is the second half of this list, it's actually my top 10. Obviously, you may see things differently, but I believe that the following items on this list are genuinely upsetting. So, let's get started. If you've never seen the 1986 film Labyrinth, you're really missing out. It's a family film made by the Jim Henson Company about a fantastical labyrinthine world full of monsters and magic. And did I mention David Bowie? Dance, magic, dance, dance, magic. But as much as this is an amazing movie, it does have a lot of creepy elements, from the Tunnel of Hands to Hoggle the Troll Prince of Stench. But there's one element that truly freaked me out as a kid, and that's a scene known as the Fiery Dance. In this scene, a bunch of red, furry monsters called the Fiery Gang dance around and start pulling their bodies apart. Is it weird that there's more than one evil dancing dismemberment scene on this list? But this is worse because these are physical puppets, and did he just pull his eyes out? And absolutely worst of all, when they're done singing and dancing, the monsters try to pull the girl's head off too. I only saw this film once or twice as a kid, and that's because I found this scene so gross. There's no blood or guts, but the idea of having your body pulled apart piece by piece was enough to get it on this list. There was a show I saw when I was a kid called Jeopardy, but not the game show that most Americans know. This was a kids' TV show about a bunch of kids from the Falkirk Academy UFO Club in Scotland that come to Australia in the hunt for extraterrestrial activity. However, after camping out in the middle of the Australian outback, one of their campers is bitten by a snake, and their bushranger guide gets lost, and the teacher supervising the group disappears over a waterfall, leaving these teenagers stranded, alone, and defenseless. It's kind of hard to portray what about this show I found so disturbing, but I have to say that especially when I was around 12 or so when I first watched this show, I found it very effective at creeping me out. Even now, looking back on the show, I didn't actually remember that it was about aliens, probably because that's a huge mystery throughout the show, whether or not they exist. So the most memorable parts of it all was that feeling of being lost, trapped, and alone out in the middle of nowhere with no chance of survival. I mean, I live in Australia, but these kids clearly didn't, and they were lost out in the middle of nowhere with no chance of seeing their family or friends ever again. Not to mention there were these faceless agents out there looking to make sure that they stayed lost. From what episodes of the show I've reacquainted myself with to write this script, I can say that it looks like it was very well filmed, even if it was definitely aimed at a younger audience, because I will never forget the way that this show made me feel. And for that reason, it's number 9 on this list. I was much too young when I started watching Daria, probably around 10 years old or so. And I don't say that because it had a lot of adult themes, even though it does, but because it was too cerebral. Today, I can appreciate it for the acerbic, misanthropic comedy it is, but as a kid, it was all talk, no action.
But he's supposed to pick us up at the mall.
He's discussing that with the car right now, but the car seems to be saying you're taking the bus.
But one episode piqued my interest. It was called Legends of the Mall, the Halloween episode. In this episode, the fashion club gets lost in a derelict part of town, which inspires everyone to start sharing scary urban legends. There's the story of the rattling girl of Lawndale, a popular girl who becomes so obsessed with perfection, she develops an eating disorder to try to thin out the fat on her eyelids. She becomes so skinny that you can hear her bones rattling, and people start laughing at her at school, so she stalks the popular girls, threatening to bite off their eyelids. Then there's Metal Mouth, the story of a stressed out workshop teacher that grinds his teeth so much he grinds them down to nothing. So he builds a pair of sharp steel dentures to replace them. Unfortunately, these metal teeth he builds pick up radio signals, which drives the man insane enough to murder his incompetent students. There's also The House of Bad Grades, and that's a story about a girl getting trapped in a bomb shelter. But as cool as that story was for me to watch now, it wasn't as creepy when I was a kid. The stories were all inspired by urban legends. You know, the Rattling Girl reminds me a lot of Bloody Mary, and Metal Mouth is clearly inspired by the Hookman legend. I think this affected me so much because I wasn't expecting such creepy ideas from an otherwise run-of-the-mill cartoon sitcom. Plus, the idea of biting someone's eyelids off is the most disgusting thing I've ever heard. When I was a kid, I enjoyed Nintendo games, but I was the youngest, so I rarely ever finished the games before we purchased more. But one game I really enjoyed was Zelda Majora's Mask. It was a pretty fun game, but it was just a little creepy, wasn't it? I mean, all the stuff with the Skull Kid and the encroaching apocalypse and that horrifying Moonface. There's just so much spooky stuff throughout this game. It's kind of cool since this game is mostly light and fun and full of action adventure, but then now and then you get these creepy elements. But one that really snuck up on me and genuinely scared me when I first saw it was the mask transitions. See, throughout the game, you can turn into a Deku, a Goron, or a Zora, and each are species that live in this world, which have special abilities you can use throughout the game. The way you turn into them is by putting on magical masks, but when you do... Good grief, that creaking, snapping sound. Is that his bones breaking? And for every single mask, he pulls an agonized face and screams. Now, you don't have to watch this every time. Most people skip it, in fact, but it's like something you'd see out of a horror movie. Thankfully, the animation for removing the masks is nowhere near as scary. And now I see that those creepy mask transitions were probably there to add the creepy atmosphere all throughout the game, but as a kid, it scared me enough to make its way onto this list. Okay, this one's a little bit odd, and I'm not sure how popular it was, but it well and truly unsettled me. Urban Legends. It's a TV show I must have watched when I was at least 16, since that's when the show first aired, but the conceit is that during the show they will present three unusual circumstances, two of which will be urban legends, and one of which will be a real, unusual story, and the audience is meant to guess which of the three is real and which are the urban legends. It's a cool show, and you learn about some cool true stories, and they even brought in actors to pretend to be the real witnesses and victims of the events for the urban legends, so it felt more real, although admittedly this is pretty cheesy and low budget. So what about this quirky little show was scary? Well, it talks about urban legends and strange but true stories, but not every single myth is big enough to make a full segment about. So for the smaller myths, before each ad break, the show aired what they would call mini-myths, and in these short animated sections, you'd be shown a couple of short scenes and given just a few seconds to determine whether it's true or not. But the animation on these short scenes was so... well, look at it. They basically take real photos of people and places and edit them into these weird cutout puppets and then animate them, which gives them all this creepy, inhuman quality. Look at her fingers. Look at this girl's eyes. Plus, since they're urban legends and creepy stories, they almost always have to do with death, pain, blood, or dismemberment. And just to get really under my skin, sometimes these creepy little mini-myths were true. Yeah, that's gonna keep me up at night. This was a pretty great show, and they were trying to have an eerie atmosphere, so these animations were done really well for that effect. But these mini-myth animations still creep me out to this day, and this is why they're number 6 on this list. Have you ever played the video game Lara Bow 2, The Dagger of Amon-Ra? It's a Sierra point-and-click murder mystery game from the 90s, and it's the sequel to the first Lara Bow game, The Colonel's Bequest. Both of these adventures were created in the style of murder mysteries, both in atmosphere and gameplay. However, unlike the first game, the graphics and sound of this game are greatly improved. In fact, the CD-ROM of the game even included voice acting.
Congratulations on the upcoming blessed event, Mr. Najia.
In this game, you play Lara Bow, who has just been hired as a journalist at the New York Daily Register News Tribune, and your first assignment is to report on the recent theft of an artifact from the Egyptian exhibit at the Leyendeckers Museum. But when one of the other guests is murdered, Lara is trapped inside the museum and must investigate who the killer is. This game can be quite a lot of fun, but there's one aspect of this game that gave me nightmares. the deaths. Several people get killed as you try to investigate the case, but whenever you discover a new body, the game shows you staring in horror and then switches to a close-up shot of their grisly remains. And it's not just for shock value either. The game expects you to investigate each murder by pointing and clicking all over the fresh corpses of the people you were sharing cocktails with a few scenes ago. I was a little kid when I first played this game, under the age of 10, and I was unprepared for the graphic detail of these murders. I think these were the first ever dead bodies I saw in fiction, not counting Disney movies, of course. They always have faces frozen in horror or anguish, and some of these deaths are pretty dreadful. Like the lady whose body was hidden in a statue, she was practically drowned in plaster. It may seem mild by the standards of gaming today, but this was enough to make its way onto this list. Scary Movie is a shit movie. The humor is crass, the pop culture references are lazy and lifeless, and this is one of the most homophobic movies I've ever seen. It's pretty disgusting. But I used to be a stupid child and enjoyed potty humor, so I watched this and laughed at it as a kid. But there was one scene that was so gross, it almost made me feel sick. It was a scene which some people might refer to as the die cheerleader die scene, but I'm just going to be upfront and call it the leg break scene. One of the characters is outwardly mocking horror film tropes, such as the cheerleader character trying and failing pitifully to escape from the killer, but she seems to go a little too far.
Oh, now I'm gonna fall and break my leg, leaving me helpless.
Oh, what the heck? She broke her leg. She doesn't even seem fazed by it. She's practically laughing. Oh, it wasn't the psycho killer. It wasn't the blood. It wasn't even the bad comedy and the homophobia that I found disturbing. It was the unflinching masochism of this cheerleader that haunts my dreams. I get that it's all a joke, and it's clear that this isn't meant to represent reality when he finally cuts her head off and she's still talking away. This wasn't even a clever parody of the "you can't escape the killer" trope, since they'd already made a similar joke earlier in the film. So you see, this was just disgusting for disgusting's sake. Ugh. This is the only entry on this whole list that I will say definitively, do not watch this. Like I said, the comedy's done poorly, it's bigoted, and it's disgusting. The only reason I am even mentioning it and thinking about it in the first place is because it's number 4 on this list. The Neverending Story is one of the best family films ever made, with one of the best theme songs ever written. This 1984 film is about an imaginative young boy who gets bullied at school when he borrows a very special book from a small bookshop in town. And then within this titular book, he reads about the world of Fantasia and how this land of myth and fantasy is being destroyed by an evil force called the Nothing. And the hero is striving to save it as a young boy called Atreyu. This is essentially a story about the value of imagination, but as with all imagination, there are dreams as well as nightmares. And as the Nothing gets closer and closer and the stakes get even higher, Atreyu must face off against an evil creature called Gmork. Gmork is this enormous talking wolf that is working with the Nothing to bring about an end to imagination. I believe it's so that people will be easier to control or something like that. Either way, it's the animatronics on this thing are good enough that he can talk and move in real time, but they're slow enough to make him move in a smooth and slightly unnatural way. It's very effective. And as well, this guy is bringing in the apocalypse. The world is literally crumbling around these characters as they're having this conversation. Plus, at the end of this conversation, Gmork just suddenly lunges at Atreyu. And sure, the fight is over quickly, presumably because Atreyu is an awesome hero, but look at the size of that monster. No matter how many times I watched this movie, I always found Gmork intimidating. And you know what? Looking back, there's Little Horrors and the Fiery Dance, and now Gmork. I've clearly got a thing about creepy puppets, since they're appearing so many times on this list. Okay, I admit I kind of find urban legends creepy. I think a lot of people do. When I was younger, I used to read about them online, and the stories I would find were pretty unsettling, but I still enjoyed them. I mean, heck, that's why I watched that urban legends show that appeared earlier on this list, so I could get more of the urban legends flavor. But that was when I was older. When I was younger, I used to watch this other show, Freaky Stories. Apparently, when this aired in Canada originally, every one of the stories was bookended by a little skit with a puppeteered cockroach and a maggot. Unfortunately, when they exported it to Australia, we didn't include any of that. We just took the little animated segments. So we were just stuck solely and purely with the urban legends, and every single one started the exact same way. This is a true story.
This is a true story.
It happened to a friend of mine.
It happened to a friend of mine, Daniel.
I usually didn't find these episodes too scary since I already recognized some, but not all, of the stories. And some of them were more family friendly than others, there wasn't any blood and gore. But there was one particular episode that really got under my skin. And that was an episode called The Mexican Dog. In this story, a family goes on vacation to Mexico, and while there, they discover an abandoned animal that they decide to keep as a pet dog. And this is where things take a turn for the freaky. See, I hadn't heard of this urban legend before, but I could tell by the way that they were deliberately never showing the animal in its entirety that whatever this thing was, it was not a dog. Now, if you've already heard of this urban legend before, you would know that it's a rat. That's the twist, it's a rat. But I didn't know that when I first watched it. I just knew that it wasn't a dog. So all I could see were glimpses of this thing. I mean, it's pretty obvious now looking back, especially in that shot of it running up through the park. I mean, that's obviously a rat's tail. But when I was a kid, my mind was reeling. What is this monster? It's not a dog. It was in Mexico. What kind of thing comes from Mexico? I mean, especially these two scenes. This one right here, where it's in the tub with him. There's just this white shape with glowing red eyes. And then this one here, where it crawls around his bed. Ugh, it's so sneaky. But then just to really hammer it all home for me, after the reveal, after showing me all these sneaky hints and clues, after keeping it hidden from me the whole time, they just go ahead and reveal the monster.
That George was really a giant sewer rat.
Oh, yeah, hi there. And then they replay all those clips again, now that you've been scarred with the knowledge that the whole time it was this twisted, ugly rat creature. Perhaps this was just a very well-written episode. Perhaps I was just a naive kid. But no matter what the reason was, the image of this leering, red-eyed rodent still makes me feel uneasy. And that's why it's number 2 on this list. Did you like Sesame Street as a kid? I mean, I loved it. I watched it on television quite a bit, and my folks even bought 1 or 2 of the VHS tapes when it came out on video. One I remember distinctly was this one called Big Bird's Story Time. I remember it because it always opened with this skit of Swedish chef getting attacked by spaghetti. That's classic Muppets. But then the show itself is basically a bunch of recycled clips from Sesame Street, all built around this framing story of Maria reading Big Bird and Snuffleupagus a bedtime story. But since the pair aren't very sleepy, Maria resorts to reading all kinds of stories, including the newspaper, and that's where we get a clip from the fairy tale news story involving Humpty Dumpty, who has just fallen off a wall. In classic Sesame Street style, they make some silly jokes as the king's horses try to put the egg back together. But here they actually manage to put the egg back to... What the fuck is that thing? Oh my god, listen to its voice.
Well, golly, I just feel like a brand new person.
Well, you certainly look like one.
Oh, that leering, crinkled up face. Why do its teeth move like that to talk? It's like the teeth are being pulled back into the face. This thing is disturbing and disfigured, with its creepy, thin little arms and a little tuft of hair on its head, and those exaggerated lips with the teeth. So many teeth. Ugh, the crazy part is this whole bit is building up to the joke that they put it back together again, but then, of course, Kermit breaks it again.
Horses, Kingsman.
But as the siren wails, when I was a kid, I got this disturbed idea that Kermit had made Humpty Dumpty angry. And maybe next time we watch that video, next time Mum put it on, when they finally managed to put him back together again, maybe this time he would put those dancing teeth of his to good use and take a bite out of Kermit the Frog. Look, I know it seems silly. I know that it seems ridiculous, but as I said at the beginning of this whole thing, horrors like these can be easily misunderstood in the mind of a small child. And my mother used to put this kind of thing on before I went to sleep. It's called Big Bird story time, after all. And this was right as my imagination was preparing to let loose. And when you're heading off to sleep, that disturbing face and the dreams it spawned, well, that's why Humpty Dumpty is number one on this list. Anyway, that was the top 10 of my list. I hope you enjoyed it. I know it's late. As I said, I planned to do this earlier, but I have a dreadful cold. I would have waited for my voice to clear up, but Halloween is upon us now. So, well, I hope you have a silly, scary, and safe Halloween this year. And let me know in the comments what kind of things scared you as a kid. I'm the Absurd Word Nerd, and until next time, I'm going to sit back, eat some candy, watch some horror movies, and have myself one hell of a Halloween. Good night.